Quick time check. What time did we end? 1 o'clock?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I had things kind of arranged to go differently than they did. And it seemed a little strange to try to stop midstream without going through these trust restoring steps that I was going to talk about. So I'm going to do that, but what it means ultimately is that the stuff I was going to present in this session on developing the next generation of leaders, that I don't think we're just not going to get to it this time. I'm sorry, I planned it. Anyway, maybe another time we'll get around to that.
You give us the link when you speak it somewhere else.
I could do that, yeah, I might do that. But anyway, so yesterday I was talking about this problem we have with trust. And what I want to do is I want to finish that, and I want to try and take that framework and I want to lay it down over one of the most sad and disturbing passages in Scripture, so we can see just how this looks and see why this is so important for laying the foundation for how we develop leaders. This is if you want to say it this way, this is the strategic level. The tactical level matters as well. That's just the part that I doubt we'll have any time to go into it in detail. But when it comes to fostering trust, there are 5 vectors that we need to be thinking about. And as I said yesterday, I'm going to move back and forth between the language of business and the language of the church. And that's actually conscious and by design. If I simply use churchly language, what I say will go, it will go in one ear and out the other. Because we become accustomed to certain kinds of phraseology, certain kinds of, they become shibboleths. They're accepted truths without really thinking through what they mean. But if I say them in marketing language, if I talk about them in the language of the corporate strategist, it'll kind of shock the system. It's still true, and it's true in church life just as it is in business life. But it's so easy for us to fall into that kind of routine rote way of thinking that we might actually miss the importance or pungency of these points. So our first step in restoring trust with people, and with that, I mean not only our own congregations, I mean the wider society, the one that we're attempting to reach, the one to whom we preach, is we need to be relevant. Now that may sound obvious, but let's try to unpack that. Awareness of our audience is not optional. Now when I was in seminary a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, this business of being relevant, one of my professors of homiletics called this exegeting the congregation. So we can talk about exegeting the text and what it means, but it always comes down to what does it mean to the people whom we serve. So in business they call it knowing your customer, and as I said yesterday, our parishioners are our customers. We don't usually call them that, but they are the consumers of the religious service that we provide. So this concept is deceptively simple though. We have to make our message fit our audience. So just as we would not try to sell, let's say, Kentucky Fried Chicken, or maybe worse, Outback Steakhouse to a vegan. Think about that one for a moment. Because it would be offensive, because it would be off target. So we have to have some understanding of the assumptions and sensitivities of our audience. Well, even qualified prospects and loyal congregants, which in this case may be roughly interchangeable, they'll find poorly timed and poorly conceived communications objectionable to them. So when we are irrelevant, we violate trust. Now let's be clear, this does not mean that we fail to speak the truth. We're not trying to amend and bend the truth in order to be popular. That's what the seeker-sensitive movement tried to do, and we see the bitter fruit of that harvest everywhere we look. Churches that are filled with disciples who are not disciples. People who think they can make Christianity mean anything they want it to mean, and if it doesn't suit them, well then that's just the way it goes. So we are not failing to speak up for the truth, but what we are doing is we are aware of the needs of our audience, and we try to do what we do in a way that makes it appropriate to them. So this would be about 5 years ago now, but I led a couple of meetings on gender wholeness in San Francisco to a group of 65 LGBT participants. It was a retreat for gay people. It was put together by their therapist, who was literally, all of them were clients of his, and all of them were people who were seeking to come out of the gay lifestyle. Most of them were Christian, but not all. They were a mixture of gays and lesbians. There were a couple of bisexuals. There were no transgendered people. And from the feedback I got from that event, it appears that I did not alienate the audience, even though I spoke directly into the topic of homosexuality. So I wasn't pulling any punches at all. But what I was trying to do was give them an option to the lifestyle that they had. They were seeing their therapist because on some level they didn't want to be gay or lesbian. I'm using gay as kind of the catch-all term, but I don't want to appear to be excluding anything either. So they started going through therapy with this individual, seeking to find something else. And one of the things that you'll find, and this is a not well explored meme within the discussion about human sexuality, and I should probably add right here in brackets, this doesn't only need to apply to sex. This could apply to something like young mothers that are trying to figure out how to deal with screaming babies and how to change diapers and how to stay sane in a world where you never sleep more than 2 hours at a time. So there's a lot of ways that this can all come into play, but I'm using this one because it, I think, so powerfully illustrates it. So these people have been coming to their counselor because they wanted to change. And one of the things that you'll find, again, not well articulated at all in the modern world, is that most gay people hate themselves. Specifically, what they hate is their sexuality. Most people don't actually want to be gay. They want a way out, but what they have been told is there is no way out. Just accept it. This is who you are. So if somebody comes along and gives them a credible, viable option that gives them a way out, there will be a small minority, yes, that are militant and are particularly dogmatic about their point of view. But what I found is that if people are given an option, they will come for it. So think about that in almost any sphere of life where you might want to be serving people and ministering people. Be relevant by understanding what their felt needs are. And figure out, and this is the hard work of the gospel, figure out how the gospel applies in their world. Now this is not just don't do it. Try harder to be good. What we want to do is provide working solutions to people that address the things that they are dealing with. So in the case of this retreat, it was highly relevant because we had 65 people who wanted to be out of this. And by the time the weekend was over, about half of them were totally and completely free. Now I know this because I stayed in touch with their therapist who was working with them, and the immediate feedback we got in the aftermath was fairly clear. People were no longer cruising same-sex individuals. They were no longer acting out. They were starting to be attracted to people of the opposite sex. They were starting to date. Ultimately, they began marrying and having children. So this is the proof that we have. Now the other half of them, they wanted to do part two because they got a lot of help. Most of them to the stage where at least they were not acting out as much, or their desires and urges were reduced. But there was a small problem. The state of California passed a law that made the administration of what became known as gender transformation therapy illegal. And so if you were a licensed therapist in the state of California doing this, they would literally take away your livelihood. They would revoke your license. So we couldn't do it. So those last half of the people They probably should have come to Melbourne, because I did part 2 in Melbourne a year later. But anyway, the relevancy part of this is that what we were doing offered hope to people. Hope that it doesn't have to be this way. And there's a way in God out of that. And so with that, hope is always relevant, but we may need to adapt our style, or maybe our word choice, not our message, but our messaging, to the needs of our audience. So, for example, if you're speaking to a group of LGBT people these days, you don't use words like queer and dyke. We might have done that 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but you learn not to use those words. But we're still working on the same problem. Does that make sense to everybody? I think in Australian parlance, moving out of that specific incident, that specific event, I don't think it's okay anymore to call women Sheilas in Australian English these days. It might have been okay 30 years ago, but you have to adapt to that. So relevance means understanding your audience. And so part of being relevant as well is being real. Now, marketing and advertising, which includes church communications, it can include even the little flyers, or nowadays the internet things that go up on our websites or that go out by email. A lot of times marketing and advertising, including church communications, is filled with hyperbole, or sometimes abbreviated to hype, and ill-defined language. And in the case of religious marketing, it may be filled with ill-defined religious language. So I always try hard. I'm not saying I get it 100% of the time, but when I'm working in religious circles, I try to make sure what I say is really clear. I don't like statements like, "You'll be blessed." What does it mean to be blessed? I'm going to get tingles and chills? I'm going to feel warmth in my body? I'm going to see an angel? I'm going to watch John McElroy up on the stage in a ballerina costume, pirouetting? I don't know what it means. Come out to the meeting. It will be the most amazing time. God's glory will be on exhibit. Well, what does that mean? Do you mean God's glory a la Exodus 24, where fire descends on the mountain and the thing is shaking and there's smoke? Or, do you mean that somebody's going to come away crying a little bit because they, experienced the time? This language thing is a big deal. And so sometimes, and here's really where the problem occurs, I don't know that Southern Cross would be a big offender in this area, but you do have to think about these things because we unconsciously slip into bad behaviors. So we have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to think through these things on a regular basis. But some people even use exaggerated communication on purpose in an attempt to grab attention. Did anyone see The Greatest Showman? Fabulous movie, loved it. But you remember when P.T. Barnum started out and he had that museum of dead animals that he was promoting how amazing it was going to be. And then his daughter goes, "Dad, this museum isn't any fun. Everything in here is dead." And so what does she do? She takes the pin and pops the balloon. But because he listened to that, which we'll come back to in a bit, because he listened to that, he readjusted and he actually became the greatest showman, right? But he was using all of this highfalutin, hyperbolic language. So most consumers, most parishioners want to do business with brands or churches that are authentic, believable, and credible. And Jesus said it this way, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil." Not just from evil in some generic, ill-defined sense, but from the enemy himself. And so we have to be relevant in what we say, and as I was trying to show you, our relevance is not just that we understand the needs of people, but the very language we use in communicating to them. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, number 2, serve, don't sell. Well, the society we live in today in the Western world, and it's true in Australia, it's true in New Zealand, it's true in America, is a me-first society. And as a consequence, people don't really want to be sold to. The reason they don't want to be sold to is when we sell to people, we put the objectives of the brand at the forefront and we use people. That's not what we're called to do. Jesus said, even the Son of Man came to serve many So selling and serving are actually in opposition to each other. So in churchly circles, when we're selling as opposed to serving, it means we're putting the institution, or sometimes the organization, ahead of the individuals who comprise it. Or to put it yet another way, do the people exist for the church, or does the church exist for the benefit of the people? Now, yesterday somebody raised the question of the Pell Commission and all that's going on there. I think that would be almost the archetypal embodiment of an institution that ran amok, and it became all about the institution rather than about serving the needs of the people, because when people, specifically priests, should have been removed from the positions they had and turned into the authorities, instead there was this shell game going on of shuffling these people around so that the problem became worse and worse and worse, and more people were victimized, all in the name of what? Protecting the reputation of the institution. See how that works? So that's one of the worst trust-destroying things that could possibly happen. So, even a cursory reading of church history, and I've just given you a recent example, but we could think back through the pages of church history. And the church has long since fallen into these kinds of patterns of behavior. Burning heretics at the stake. You know, Galileo comes to mind. I can remember being in high school and somebody brought up the issue of Galileo in the church. I didn't even know what it was. So I got, a quick baptism by fire. But, people have long memories. They think about what these things mean. People remember what happened to their grandparents when they were run out of this church or that church because, something went on. And usually they don't even remember all the details, but it hangs in the air. Well, we don't use the term cannon fodder anymore because it's too graphic and politically incorrect. But they used to talk about cannon fodder in the military. What was that? We don't care about all those enlisted people. We send them forward of the lines while the officers hold back. The officers, of course, embody everything that is supposed to be the culture and the style, the aristocracy of the military. And so we send those who are cannon fodder to the front, and they are, well, literally fodder for the cannon. They're cut to the ground with grape shot or canister or whatever, and with blood everywhere, but that's just the way it goes. Or how about this one from the movie Braveheart? You might remember the famous line where William Wallace says to Robert the Bruce, "You think the people of this country exist to provide you with position. I think your position exists to provide those people with freedom, and I go to make sure they have it." Well, churches can fall into the trap, as I've already said. So part of how we solve this is we revert to, this is an age-old adage, but one that maybe has fallen from use in our day. We find a need and we fill it. Find a place where people are in need of help and meet that need. It's funny, someone came up to me yesterday and wanted to talk about dissociative identity disorder, DID. And I was going to talk with them at dinner, but I ended up at dinner with John and Elaine, and others that came, not to exclude anyone. So I didn't actually make it to the Boulevard dinner, so I still need to have that conversation. But this morning, I got a message from a friend of mine who's studying mental health, getting a master's in public health, mental health, in the state of New York. And she just sent a message and said, "Have you seen any success with DID? Because they tell us in our class that there's really no hope for this." And one person in our case studies had 56 personalities. So I just wrote back and said, "Sure, we see DID healed all the time." And so, but it's too much to go into by text. "Okay, great, I'll see you when you come to New York in April." But right there, you can see there's a need in society, right? So what are we doing with that need? Are we addressing that? Are we going after that thing? Is it a lot of work? Sure, it can be a lot of work. No one ever said that kingdom work isn't work. But we find a need and we fill it in this kind of, I'm going to call it service-oriented thinking, places our consumer, known as a parishioner, in the priority seat. So once we've actually provided what that is, then we have to help them find ways to use the product or the service. Or in this case, to access the grace that's available through the church. And so finding a way for people to do that, and this is a simple term for it, problem solving. This is a time-tested way of serving people. Now, the more people use a product or a service, the more they interact with that which you're all about, the more loyal they become. Now, let's go back to Apple Computer. I'm, again, using many different examples to try to illustrate these concepts, because we don't even usually talk about these things in churchly circles, so we need lots of word pictures to flesh them out. But when you start talking about Apple Computer, and yes, I am using an Apple iPad, yes, I have an Apple phone in my pocket. I didn't start out as an Apple user. I started out in the Android Microsoft world. I came out of corporate, and in those days, Apple wasn't really viable in a corporate context. Not only that, they narrowly escaped bankruptcy. But Apple came back from the grave, so to speak, and they got their act together. And I think that should give us hope, because if Apple could turn around and thrive, the church can do that too. You know who else did that? Harley-Davidson motorcycles. 30 years ago, Harley-Davidson motorcycles was associated with what? The Hells Angels. Nowadays, what do you think of when you think of Harley-Davidson? 60 or 70-year-old men with a lot of money who like to get all suited up, and then they go, cruising on the road, usually in groups of their mates, right? But Harley has completely repositioned the brand through this that I'm talking about. So let's go back to Apple. How do they do it? Well, Apple doesn't really care very much if you start your Apple experience with an iTouch, an iPod, an iPhone, an iPad, or a Macintosh computer. They don't care. They just want you to get involved somehow. And then once you become involved, you become, well, a little more involved, because there's a migration path that's clearly in mind. It's that ultimately Apple owns every interface you have. You get an iPhone, you've got an iPad, you might do away with the iTouch or the iPod because you've got the iPhone, but if you're a kid, that's a great entry-level product that will make them consumers before they're ever ready to buy. And of course, all of these things interact seamlessly, and John, you even made a comment about it in the car park yesterday, right? You said, I just got a new Macintosh computer and I love Apple because everything interfaces seamlessly. Microsoft hasn't figured that out. So, no matter what the entry point, the migration path is clear. You become a devotee, you become a convert, you become a user, because you're constantly interacting with Apple, and in the end you forsake all other technology platforms in favor of Apple. Now, that one probably doesn't need any explication of what that means in church life. We want people to think of God, and in this case, the church that we lead, as the primary access point for finding answers to life's problems. They don't need their drugs. They don't need their booze. They don't need their porn. They don't need their whatever, because God has an answer for that. And what do you know? Right here is a house of glory, or whatever we're going to call this place, and it's going to be the primary interface where they can find that grace that God makes available. And as they say, well, God healed my body, I wonder if he could heal my retarded child or my whatever. I wonder if he can heal my marriage. I wonder if there's a way to bring God into my broken family relationships, and so we can stop having all this pain all the time. And so when we're talking about the church, what we're really talking about is becoming a disciple. Now, discipleship has a lot of facets to it. I have a series on discipleship, which is very mechanically driven. It's all about specific competencies that we look for in disciples. But in this case, right now, what I'm talking about is becoming a disciple means we show people, show before we tell. We demonstrate, we show people how and why Christianity is relevant to their lives. How and why Christianity is relevant to their lives. Helping them understand how to apply the truths of Scripture to the real world problems they face. And somewhere in all that, we call them to submit their desires and their lives to the Lordship of Christ. Because, as we all know, because we're here in this room as leaders, when these things are submitted to the Lordship of Christ, life goes better. But people don't know that on the front end. So we have to give them a little bit, and as they see the value of it, they'll say, I want to put that into more of my life. I want that to consume more of my bandwidth. I want that to define more of my value set and how I make decisions. Well, this, of course, leads to a potentially uncomfortable question, and that is what we sell good enough to warrant that kind of devotion? Now, I'm not talking about the brand promise, i.e., the true value of Christianity, reconciliation with the Father, being born again, experiencing eternal life beginning in this life, possibly getting healing for your body or whatever it may be. I'm not talking about the brand promise. I'm talking about the brand experience, because one of the fastest ways to destroy a brand is to promise much and deliver little. And I fear that for the church, a lot of what's gone on is there's been a lot of big talk, but there's not a lot of execution. And in that, the brand delivery falls dramatically short. And so, sure, we believe in our own product and message. We wouldn't be in ministry if we didn't. But we have to own the lapses. We have to own the gaps in what's being delivered to the people who come to us. And so owning these shortcomings means a lot more than just acknowledging that there are lapses and gaps. You know, you hear these things from time to time where a politician will make a gaffe on open mic. I remember during the presidential election in the United States, Hillary Clinton was caught on mic calling New York Heine Town. Well, you know, that's kind of a fatal flaw. And she said, I'm sorry that I've offended the Jewish community of New York. Well, she wasn't sorry. Everybody knew that she wasn't sorry. And we don't even need to talk about the video that came out about Donald Trump talking about certain parts of women's bodies, right? So, this sort of thing, it goes on. And, in terms of the sexual problems that have gone on in the church, you get these official pronouncements, we deeply regret the damage and pain that have been caused in people's lives and so forth. That might be more heartfelt in the church. You'd like to think it's more heartfelt. But again, is that enough? So when these gaps exist, it means that we have to engage proactively to eliminate those exact failings. We don't just acknowledge them, we do something about it. And while we don't want to grandstand, we do need to have it be visible that we are taking ownership of these things and they are no longer part of those areas where we have fallen short. Does that make sense? So quiet, I don't know if I'm offending, causing you to think, or missing the mark. It could be any of the above. So, in churchly circles, we want people to understand how one or more members of the Godhead, each being a distinct person but all sharing one divine essence, addresses their felt needs. So in the retreat that I was talking about a few moments ago, I sought to show people both by word and by action, through actual ministry, that the Lord has a solution for sexual brokenness that goes beyond merely trying harder to be good. And that the solution works, and the testimonies themselves will bear evidence of what goes on in that area. Now, as I said yesterday, I don't really like ever using myself as an example. But when it comes to that specific subject matter, I don't have 20 others that I can point to right now. We're looking to raise those people up. But I can tell you this, that as a result of the many successes the Lord has given, I get calls all the time, and emails and texts and whatever, from like major league politicians and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who have issues in their lives, and they always come like Nicodemus by night. I heard that there's an answer to this problem, and that you're somebody who knows how to do this. Can I get a meeting with you? Would you fly to Dallas? Would you fly to New York? Would you come to Washington? Would you come to Tokyo? Would you be willing to go to Tehran? And so, these things kind of build their own momentum over time. Does that make sense? I think what we want to do then is, in this point too, is with that gap closure, we're looking to achieve what in the business world is called best practices. And if I dare say this, in many circles of the church, good enough is good enough. But actually, in most spheres of life, good enough isn't good enough. And so we need to adopt that kind of an ethic in the way we deliver whatever it is that we're doing. Now, I get it. We're resource constrained. We're time constrained. We don't have enough volunteers. We're fighting with the town council, and we're trying to, get a hall, and it was a miraculous thing that you're in this building. I mean, we're constantly up against these things, but hey, this is the biblical norm. I mean, this is what people dealt with all the time in the pages of the Bible. And the clear story in the pages of the Bible is what? God came through anyway. So, we don't want to get down on ourselves, but we do want to call ourselves higher. The reason I said we don't want to get down on ourselves is sometimes people get so wrapped up with this that it becomes a performance thing. I'm not doing good enough, therefore I'm not worthy. We don't want to fall to that. All right, the third thing we have to do as we're rebuilding trust is we have to be consistent. Now, with this, the brand promise has to remain constant across all channels and with every contact. So, we've all undoubtedly had experiences where we had maybe one experience on a company website and a different experience with the actual product or service. But a consistent consumer experience is crucial for maintaining trust and maximizing customer loyalty. So let's switch out of business language, and in church circles, this means that the types of interactions parishioners have with our organization should be consistent across all ministry functions. It doesn't matter whether it's the nursery, the Sunday school, the youth ministry, the young adults or college and career, whatever they call that, kind of early 20s, late teens piece of the ministry, the women's ministry, the men's ministry, the benevolence ministry, the evangelism ministry, of course what comes out of the pulpit, the prayer ministry, the counseling ministry. There should be a consistent touch, a consistent feel, a consistent messaging that's running through everything. This means that as leaders, we're responsible for training those who will work in our churches so that they all kind of are on the same page. And when we were driving over this morning, and John was sharing about somebody who was working at Churchlands at one point, and they started speaking out against the very kind of ministry that Churchlands was doing. Well, obviously that's a problem. That person's no longer there, as you might expect. But this becomes a bigger and bigger issue as we move to larger congregations or larger movements, as congregations proliferate within our movements. Because people have a lot of ideas. And this became such a problem in a denomination that I worked with a while back, that a number of churches started leaving the denomination because there was so much diversity. I might even change the word diversity to disparity among the churches from church to church, that they felt that there was no congruence between themselves and sister congregations. And so they couldn't have that brand identity across the congregations. So somebody went to this church in town A, and the same brand of church in town B, they hear something totally different, or see something totally different, experience something totally different. And those that were in the group that left, they said, we're trying to actually build towards what we've always said we believe, but all these other people don't do that anymore. So, it's not actually working. There's no benefit to us in being part of the brand. This is what's killing denominations like the Uniting Church, the Episcopal Church. Because there's such a dogs and cats breakfast of winds of doctrine that are blowing through, that those who are holding to the original gospel actually can't identify with the very people that are supposed to be their comrades in arms. I'm watching the United Methodist denomination in the United States get torn apart by this exact issue right now. So going back to Apple Computer, think about Apple Computer. There's a common interface, there's a common touch across everything, whether you're using an iPhone, an iPad, a computer, even the icons look the same. Everything functionally functions the same. We have to create that kind of experience within our organizations. Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, it means somebody's got to be the sheriff and say, what you're doing here isn't really consistent with what we're trying to do overall. Whether it's in the specific microcosm of the congregation or the wider macrocosm of the movement, you say, we love you, but what you're doing isn't what we're doing. So you've got to You've got to get some sort of consistency in this. Yes, there's flexibility, there's an organic nature to this. We can't be too rigid, but neither can there be no definition at all. So as I said, this particular denomination back in the United States, they basically splintered as a result of this dilution of the brand. And so that denomination, that phenomenon is underway on a wholesale basis with many of our mainline denominations as they struggle with basic core branding issues like biblical inerrancy, sexual fidelity and chastity, and the nature of the afterlife. And I'm naming only three. There could be many others that we could talk about. And so in that case, the very concept of what it means to be a Christian is up for grabs. And as the apostle said, if the trumpet does not sound a clear note, how will they know to prepare for battle? So what is part of this point 3? You got to know who you are and what you stand for. All right, step 4, build community. Well, we want to be human, we want to be approachable, we want to have personality. Now in the business sense, here's what it means. Consumers want to do business with people, not with organizations. Now they're doing business with organizations, but organizations are comprised of people. So they want a human face, they want a human touch, they want a human interface. Has anyone here ever called any kind of a helpline and you get that mechanical voice response unit? Is that annoying? Of course it's annoying. And by the time you get to a live human being, oftentimes you're so hostile from dealing with that amorphous, impersonal voice response thing, and press option 3, then option 6, then 4, then 1. By the time you get there, you're just struggling to maintain your composure in Christ. But a lot of times there's that same sort of wooden, not invented here kind of thinking that goes on in organizations, and in churches. So what we have to do is find multiple ways to incorporate people into our faith communities, not just one. And understand this, that when you're starting out as a church leader, as a ministry leader, you are the drawing card. You are the drawing card. People are coming because they want to associate with you. They don't want to associate with your organization, your system. John Wimber used to say it this way: when you plant a church, the first 200 people are yours to win and clean and disciple. A lot of times people are trying to hand that function off too soon. And so what you get are people who are talking heads. I'm thinking of one man I know, I won't name who he is, but this guy has a very large church, several thousand people, and I consider him the consummate talking head. He gets up and he gives these sermons that are correct in all the theoretical sense, but he literally has no contact with his congregation during the week. He shows up for one single 1-hour staff meeting with his staff each week. And other than that, he has an office that is remote from the church, and the only person who knows how to reach him besides his wife is his assistant, and even she's only allowed to contact him 1 hour a day. Now, it's an extreme example, but it shows you where this goes. So is that man actually pastoring his church? I would submit to you he is not. He's a speaker at his church. He has the title of pastor of his church, but he's not actually pastoring his church. And do you know what that does? It destroys trust. It makes that person like a TV personality, or if their people are less kind, they call him a talking head. And if you're a talking head, you have no authority among the people to whom you minister. So maybe this is part of why Paul said to Timothy, I'm slightly out of context in saying it, and I acknowledge that, but I still think it has some relevance. It may be part of why Paul had said to Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. Be one who gathers with people. Be one who joins people. Be one who's accessible. You say, well, but I got all these other things to do. I mean, how am I going to be accessible? Find ways, make ways, create intentionality around when and how you'll be accessible. You don't have to be accessible 24/7, but let people know when you are accessible so that porosity factor exists. Does that make sense? Now, this can become such a problem, particularly as things crystallize, that, I've talked with many people who have left churches for this reason. They have been there and they've actually wanted to be involved. So this isn't the low commitment person, this is the person who's looking to commit. But it was so many gates they had to go through, so many forms they had to fill out, that in the end they just said, forget it, I don't want to be involved, and they went and found someplace else to go. Churches can fall into that. And when they do, they look like the government. I'll give you a really good, well, bad example of what it looks like with the government. Now, back in the days before they were, monitoring how much liquids you could bring on airplanes, I was at a security checkpoint at the San Jose, California airport. And as I was going through security, there was a woman in front of me, and she got a little bit addled at something that one of the checkpoint people had said to her. And all of a sudden, there was this loud, freeze! And everybody in the room froze, like that. And I'm not kidding, out come 4 TSA guys, fully armed in full battle rattle. 2 of them are carrying M16s. And they pointed in on her, and I was right behind her, so I'm in the line of fire, right? And the person who was at the checkpoint had given this woman this instruction, and she wasn't old, but she was not a young woman either. She'd gotten addled, she didn't quite understand what was being asked of her, and I watched the whole thing go on, and this person says in a very imperious and somewhat officious tone, "The detainee has not surrendered the object of interest." Which it turned out was just a bottle of wine. I mean, we're in San Jose, California. Napa Valley was 30 minutes away. So she'd gotten a bottle of wine, and for some reason they wanted to look at it. I don't know, anyway. So they took her aside and took her into an interrogation room, and later on I saw her in the concourse. So I walked over and I said, "How are you doing?" And she started shaking and crying all over again. She said she never wanted to fly again. Was there any wonder? Well, think about that with respect to our churches. Now, we don't usually have that go on in churches of 50 or 100 people. But it does happen in churches of 3 to 500 or 1,000 or 5,000. So as our congregations grow, this becomes an increasingly difficult thing to overcome. And I just wonder how many, shall we say, less provocative examples of behavior like that checkpoint in San Jose we might be able to think of from our own experiences of church. And this will alienate people, and it will destroy trust. So when we think about our congregations, voice tone, word choice, facial expression, body language, all of these things communicate powerfully whether we are a user-friendly group. There's been a lot of studies done on this, and over the studies say this, that our words convey 7% of the content of communication. The other 93% comes through voice tone, facial expression, body language, etc. Well, wait a minute, it gets worse. Because in group settings, now in group settings we're talking about the culture of a church. We're talking about how we do what we do collectively. In group settings, that 7% falls to 4%. And that's another way of saying that our collective nonverbal signals and cues are 25 times more effective at communicating who we are and what we represent than what we say with our words. 25 times more effective. I'm letting that sink in. So, when we think about our churches, we're creating a brand voice, and we have to be sure that it's understood by everyone in the church, not just us as leaders. Everyone in the church has to understand what that brand voice is. Who are we? What are we trying to communicate to the community? How are we doing that? Why are we doing that? This is the job of leadership. Military commanders understand this. You can't get promoted in the military unless you know how to train a unit to a certain level of competency and efficiency. And, when you talk about, well, that guy's got the most operationally ready unit in the military, boom, 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 boom. I'm quite sensitive to this right now because my daughter is going to commission in the U.S. Army in about 6 weeks. And she is the best cadet, I'm told by her commanding officer. She's the best cadet that they've ever had, well, I shouldn't say that, in the last 20 years at Washington State University where she's attending. And because of that, excellence that she brings, I'm a little bit proud of her, yes. Because of that excellence that she brings, they've made her the battalion commander at Washington State University. They flew her to the Pentagon to meet the commanding officer of all of the ROTC program for the entire United States Army. Yeah, she's done really well with this, but you know what he said to me was, the thing that's interesting about your daughter is I've watched her interact with other cadets. When we have cadets that are addled, that don't know what they should be doing, she has this way about her to come alongside them and explain it to them and sort them out and keep them going so that the unit doesn't break down in its efficiency and operational tempo. He said, you know, the other thing that I've noticed about her is when there's cadets that are, you know, they're not in shape, they're not up to speed, that it can't go on a march, their pack is too heavy. She somehow comes alongside them and encourages them in a way that they can make the march happen, and they finish the march anyway. And so on like this are the competencies that this commander is identifying, and what she has managed to do is foster that through the entire battalion so that when they went on a green flag exercise at the brigade level with 5,000 other cadets, her battalion came in as the best performing battalion of all of them, and she was herself one of the top 3 who received a commendation from the commanding officer of the ROTC program for what she did. Now again, I'm proud of my daughter, yes, but I'm using her as an example of what happens when this is being infused through the body of an organization, and where you say, this is the standard we are aiming for. So, let's put this in church life. So to create a brand voice and make sure that it's understood by everyone in the church, we can't, for example, allow our churches to be dominated and defined by, excuse the term, blue-haired ladies who have narrow personal agendas. John Wimber used to say, every church has a boss, and usually it's a blue-haired lady. Because they've been around a long time. They know where all the bodies are buried, and they have a lot of institutional control. Sorry?
Julie needs to die of hate.
Or, lest you think I'm a sexist, we don't want odd men who evoke memories of our Uncle Fudd, who, you know, we allow to come to family dinners, but then we're happy to put him in the back room or, you know, scurry him out the door. So once the church's identity or brand is clear, then we want to empower both the staff and the parishioners to express that voice through their own personalities. This is what we mean when we say we're becoming a people, or we're establishing a culture. By the way, this language of establishing culture, this is all the rage right now. They're using this exact language in Hillsong, they're using it at Bethel. I mean, this is the term. But nobody's defining what it really means. I'm telling you what it means. And I'm telling you how to make it happen so that your church is one that is embracing and warm and affirming, user-friendly, that people will want to get involved with. Now, is that hard work? Yes. Will it take time? You bet. Will you have to think through a lot of things clearly? Will you have to write it down and pass it out on sheets and walk people through it? Yes. And when you see people breaking ranks with it, do you have to go alongside and say, you know, I know you mean well, but what you're doing isn't actually what we're trying to do. Here's where it's falling short and why, so please change that so it looks like that. Yeah. Is that not fun? It's not fun. But this is the task of leadership. This is what we do. And you do it in business, you do it in church life, you do it in politics, you do it in the military. I mean, this is what it looks like when we carry this out. Step 5, listen and learn. Now, I could have made this one point 1. You know, I could have said, go out and poll everybody, find out what their felt needs are, and then start addressing them. But a lot of times, you don't have that to begin with, especially if you're a younger church planter. You're just in a community, and all you can do is look around and go, looks to me like there's a lot of problems in this area. There's a lot of youth hanging around in the parks at night. So that tells me there might be a problem with what are kids doing with themselves in their free time. Maybe the best thing we can do is start some kind of youth program in a community center. Because you can't really go and do that kind of polling. But once you get a little bit of momentum, you can have a feedback loop, and you can start listening to those that are working with you and learning from them. So that's why I say I could have made it point 1, but I put it as point 5 because what we're really describing is a circle of continuous improvement. And those of you that have, bivocational ministries, and I know there are several of you because I've talked with you, just as I've been here, you know this language from the outside world. So this step is the one that informs the next iteration of the journey. It's how we get better. So listening and learning applies to both internal and external stakeholders, those in the church and those who are outside in the wider communities in which we live and function. So we want to encourage two-way communication and not react negatively, which is usually known as shooting the messenger. And we have to be prepared to act on the feedback that we receive, because two-way dialogue is authentic and it supersedes rote or canned speech or easy answers. Back to my comment about the sort of standard apologies that we get from politicians when they're caught saying things that they shouldn't be saying. And by the way, two-way communication exhibits a robust optimism. It's not an unbridled optimism, but it's a robust optimism. And the difference is, unbridled optimism is Pollyanna-ish. It's, everything's going to be great. It should be right now. But a robust optimism says, I see the challenges and obstacles, but with God they can be overcome because God has an answer to everything. And we just got to figure out what that is. So here would be a way of thinking about that. When you look at marriage breakdown, and it's a pandemic in Australia as well as America. When you see marriage breakdown, do you view it as a lack of commitment or as an inability to sustain loving relationship? If you view it as lack of commitment, you'll tend to do this. You need to be more committed, just stick it out, it's tough. But if you see it instead as an inability to sustain loving relationship, you might say, there's a felt need that I can fill. Because there's a lot of people in this community whose marriages are breaking down, and if I can teach them good relational skills and the ability to sustain relationships by not violating them through obnoxious and offensive behaviors, most specifically right inside the home, maybe those marriages could thrive and survive. And I guarantee you, if you taught people those skills, they would be immensely grateful, because nobody really wants to go through a divorce. It's way too painful. It's way too expensive. It's way too time-consuming. So what have you just done? You've added value to somebody's life, and you've created trust. You're building brand awareness, and people go, the church helped me survive at that. Rocky helped me survive at that. And not only that, I've now learned that marriage is fun. It's not just a war. It's not just a battle within my own four walls. So that is an example of it. So how do we meet that need? How about this one? Do you see the amendment of the Marriage Act as an act of defiance, of deviancy, of sexual perversion, or as a cry for help of people who are looking for intimacy and love and don't know how to find it with somebody of the opposite sex? And so maybe we could present credible answers to the sexually broken. I keep coming back to that one because I think that is the single biggest social issue of our time. The second biggest is opioids. But I could talk about opioids and just not picking that one instead. Gender issue. But anyway, one way we create hope is by creating collaborative environments where information is shared freely across boundaries and across touch points. And we actively disseminate that information rather than keeping everything confidential. Now, yes, of course, there are things that have to be kept confidential. But really what we're trying to do is create an environment in which only that which must be kept confidential is kept confidential. Everything else is freely distributed, because what that does is it fosters trust, it fosters inclusion. So controlling information flow, or having an adversarial kind of relationship, as with these two social situations that I described, is one of the hallmarks of the old style of institutional leadership, the very thing that I was addressing yesterday when I started out. And inclusion, on the other hand, is a hallmark of the relationship era. So, for long-term sustainability, when we think about our communications with those that come to us, our customers, our parishioners, we want to be intentional and purpose-driven, integrated, and interdependent. All of those words matter. Intentional, have a plan. Purpose-driven, you know where you're going to. Integrated, everything interlocks and is a web that builds to a greater goal. And it's interdependent, which means we rely upon each other. Because what's happening is we're creating a message with our actions. We're creating a message with what we deliver, how we carry out our services. And as Marshall McLuhan reminded us a generation ago, the medium is the message. It used to be we just said the message is the message, but we figured out that that's not true. And if the messaging doesn't have value, it won't take long before our customers, our parishioners, start asking questions like, why are you in my communication stream every day? Why do I get emails from this church anyway? They don't do anything that makes sense to me. Or they may say, why do I go to this church? What's in it for me? Why am I spending my time on this? Usually, Christians won't ask questions quite this directly, but sometimes they will. It'll usually be the younger Christians that are just coming into the faith and don't kind of know all the social etiquette. And so they'll be a little more blunt about things. Or there'll be older Christians who think they're mature, but actually have never matured in Christ at all. And when the kid gloves come off, they look like a younger Christian. But eventually their actions will tell you they're disengaging and they're becoming disinterested. And so to offset that disengagement, we have to know not only our customers, but also the purpose behind our communication and how it fits them. And the best single way to get to that is when you send out an email or you put out a marketing, whatever it is, or you are communicating about upcoming church events, or even if you're writing a sermon, ask yourself this question: can I summarize this message, whatever this message is, in one sentence? One and only one sentence. One single, simple sentence. If I can't do that, I'm not clear enough. I'm not targeted enough. So go back and rethink it for 5 minutes. It probably won't take you that long, but 5 minutes is usually enough to clarify it, where you can say, this is what I really want to say. And if after 5 minutes you're still struggling with it, you're not focused enough, and that means you're destroying trust with your communication with people. You're destroying trust organizationally because you aren't focused in where you're going. Does that make sense? All right. Building and maintaining trust is a long-term commitment. That's my conclusion here. Trust is an intangible and an elusive concept, and brands, and in this case we're talking about the reputation of our churches and our movements, they have to continually evaluate and find new ways of cultivating trust and building and reinforcing those relationships. So a recent article in a magazine called Advertising Age, again, I'm deliberately moving back and forth between business language and theological language. A recent article in Advertising Age summarized the importance of trust this way. It said, in the relationship era, the big winners will be sustainable, whose habitués typically spend little on advertising because they don't